So with that, the event concludes. With this, we have come to the end of the session. I hope you must have enjoyed the technical feast. We have a tea or lunch break from 10:30 to 11.
Mobility topic. We have three eminent speakers for this plenary session. Chairman is Mr. Rajan Wadhera, President Mahindra and Mahindra Limited. And we have two speakers, Dr. V. Sumantran, Chairman Celeris Technologies, and Mr. Moran, co-founder and CEO Zoom Cars. Let's give a big round of applause to invite the chairman and two speakers on the dais. It's my great honor to introduce Mr. Rajan Wadhera, chairperson of this session. Mr. Rajan Wadhera is the president of automotive sector of Mahindra and Mahindra. He's a member of the group executive board. He's also the president of Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers. Rajan is a B.Tech and M.Tech from IIT Bombay and a graduate of the Advanced Management Program from the Wharton Business School, USA. He has over 37 years of diverse experience in various facets of automotive, as well as farm equipment sector like research and development, technology, and sourcing and operations. Under his leadership as Chief Executive of Technology, Product Development, and Sourcing of Auto and Farm sectors at Mahindra and Mahindra Limited, Rajan led the development of projects like XUV 500, E2O, Xylo, Thar, Maximo, to name a few. He was instrumental in setting up an offshore engineering and development center for auto sector, the North American Technology Center at Detroit. Rajan was also instrumental in establishing the Mahindra Research Valley at Chennai. Rajan is the former president of Automotive Research Association of India, the leading homologation and certification authority in India. Rajan is the chairman of the board at Mahindra Graphic Research Design, Mahindra Heavy Engines Limited, and Mahindra North American Technical Center. He is also a director on a holding company of Pennsylvania, Mahindra Automotive North America, and Mahindra Electric Mobility Limited. With this brief introduction, I invite Mr. Rajan Wadhera to introduce our speakers and to lead the panel.
Very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to introduce the speakers today. Dr. Sumantran, who is the chairman of the Celeris Technologies and advisor to several Fortune 100 organizations. Sorry for that. He is also was the special advisor to Mr. Carlos Ghosn, who's the chairman of the Renault-Nissan Mitsubishi Alliance. And he has written the book on faster, smarter, greener, the future of car and urban mobility, which has been published by the MIT Press in the fall of 2017. He was executive vice chairman of the Hinduja Automotive UK, the auto and the manufacturing sector holding company of the Hinduja Group, as also the vice chairman of Ashok Leyland. Prior to that, he was the chief executive officer of Tata Motors Business and was directly reporting to Mr. Ratan Tata. Prior to joining Tata's, Dr. Sumantran had a 16-year career with General Motors with their R&D operations in Detroit, and subsequently he served on deputation in Europe as Director R&D at the GM Europe. Dr. Sumantran has served on Science Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of India and the Scientific Advisor Committee of the Cabinet of the Indian Government. He also possesses a doctorate degree in aerospace engineering, Princeton and Virginia Tech, and a master's degree in management of technology, a distinguished alumnus of the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a fellow of the Indian National Academy of Engineers and a fellow of the Society of Automotive Engineers International. He served on the board of SAE International and was editor SAE Transactions between 1994 and 2000. He's a founder director of Chennai City Connect, which is a non-profit think tank and advocacy that works with the local city administration and the citizen groups to address issues related to urbanization, mobility, environment, and affordability. Sir, you are also a role model of the auto and the engineering fraternity. Now let me introduce you to Moran, who's going to be our other panelist. Greg is the CEO of Zoom Car India, and he is also the co-founder. Greg has a very distinguished career in financial and technologies and startups. He worked with the Marshall School of Business, where he founded South California's first interdisciplinary student-run energy club. He was also had a hand at his own consulting organization called Moran Consultancy. He was there in Fieldstone Private Capital, which performed detailed financial modeling and provided commercial due diligence support in the area of power and renewable and conventional energy areas and in biofuel companies. He was in Celeris Capital Management as a summer associate, has a degree in international relations, and did his MBA from the Marshall School of Business in Finance and Entrepreneurship. And I'm very delighted to have Greg today with us in the panel. So friends, can we have a big round of applause for the two gentlemen here? Yeah. So what we're going to do is that I'll just talk briefly about a topic for the day today, which is on the disruptive technologies and how does shared mobility come in terms of paving its way out, etc. I will request each of the panelists to come and talk for 10-15 minutes as they deem fit. We will do a little bit of interaction followed by question answers to the audience. That's the way we planned it. And can we have somebody put up my presentation that I have? So very much, I think the question in front of us is why should shared mobility happen in India? What is the need? And how do we see it panning out? How do we see it getting developed, getting deployed? And also, there needs to be business models that will make shared mobility proliferate much faster. As you all know that the need for shared mobility is coming from various compulsions that we all have. I think the foremost is the urbanization, which is happening very rapidly, leading to a lot of congestion, leading to pollution, leading to the other compulsion of energy security. And this, to my mind, are the key drivers of disruptive technologies that will help to reduce all this. India is going to be a home to many new megacities. Unfortunately, we have 9 out of the 10 most polluted cities in the world. And also, the 80% of our fuel is imported and creating huge pressures on the country. These, to my mind, are the key drivers that need to be addressed by the technologies, which my fellow panelists would expand on. Here, clearly, the disruptions that are shaping up are leading to shared mobility, but simultaneously, along with shared mobility, there are other needs that are emerging, which is how do we stay connected? How do we stay autonomous as well because of the other compulsions that are coming in the society in terms of the need to avoid the accidents, the need to not having enough drivers, and also many other requirements which are leading for the autonomous vehicle. And all these bits and pieces of the puzzle that is getting evolved and developed, in a way is also going to lead to practically zero emissions on the road. With this, accidents, as I said, will be far and few. There will be a lot of elimination of waste that will happen. Congestion is going to go down. Costs are going to come down on account of these 4 trends. And above all, I think the energy security of any country is going to improve. We are seeing that the way the evolution is happening, I can clearly see 3 distinct areas. One, there will be objects that will be clearly objects of desire, and there will be objects of mobility, and the third one will be the premium cars. Now, the intelligent guess is that adoption of the shared mobility and various other researches that are there is very clear that objects of mobility will take greater thrust, push, investments by most of the companies. Also, objects of desire over a period of time will dwindle and their ratio will go down. Premium cars at the moment will remain, but that's very few and little. So most of the product development, most of the technology development is going to happen around this objects of mobility. And we are already seeing that happening in a very small way. But we are here to look into the future. And I will request the panelists if they could talk a little more about how this is going to pan out. Also, this cannot happen without enough sustainable business models. This cannot be for charity. After all, people have to make money with the technology that is getting evolved. And we have already seen that Olas and Ubers are there in the e-hailing. There is Zoom Car and Avis, which are have a business model out of vehicle sharing. There is going to be now talk of ride sharing, where also Uber and Ola, I understand, are developing their systems and procedures to make sure how they can even create a business out of this. But very largely, we are seeing it in China, and we are seeing it in India and other parts of Europe, where the bus shared mobility on electric, etc., is taking new form. And there is an agency called Shuttle, which is making a business proposition out of it. So therefore, to me, it's very clear that objects of mobility will be the focus of development and will become the business models of future. So with that perspective around our panel, our discussion, I would request Dr. Sumantran to come and share with us his views and how he sees the electric mobility, the shared mobility, the disruptions that we are talking of panning out. And he is a very worthy speaker, having written a book on this topic. So let's get richer by his perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's truly a privilege, an honor to be here with all of you at this FISITA forum. I'm delighted that the FISITA forum has showed up in my hometown of Chennai after so many years. So welcome to FISITA and welcome to all the delegates on behalf of Chennai. What I'm going to speak about is to elaborate on some of the topics that Rajan just talked about. Certainly, we're beginning to see recognition around the world that what we had assumed in the auto industry to be the evolution of mobility is going through a lot of change. We're at an epochal cusp right now, and this is not just me speaking. We find leaders around the world talking about the fact that we are seeing an epochal quantum of change right now, and as in this case, Akio Toyoda says, it's not just a matter of who's going to win or lose, it's going to be a matter of how we survive and continue to participate and be relevant in future mobility. Admittedly, the auto industry is working very hard to be relevant to this new future. And as Rajan mentioned, the kinds of technologies we're deploying are related to electrification, to connectivity, to sharing of mobility, and to autonomy. But I'm often reminded by what George Bernard Shaw used to say, science never solves a problem without creating 10 more. So even as we start to bring in all these technologies, it's important that we understand what is it that we are trying to solve. Mobility, after all, is a social topic. It is a social need. And unless the technologies we're going to deal with are going to be aligned to fulfilling that social need, we're going to create even more chaos. So we went back to really understanding what are truly the drivers of change that we are seeing? What is it that is precipitating this kind of transformation? Imagine the possibilities that we have today as a combination of technologies and business opportunities, and to propose an architecture for the future, noting that literally every city around the world has different constraints and different requirements. And therefore, we're going to have to need an architecture of mobility that is truly going to be flexible and conducive to a very wide range of needs. To start with, Rajan mentioned about the urbanization issue. You know, Thomas Friedman talked about the world getting flat. While it's true that we're getting flatter in terms of democratization of opportunities, the world is also getting spikier, as Richard Florida explains. And this is a consequence of concentrations of urban populations. This is happening all over the world. To the point where, at the dawn of the 20th century, 1 out of every 6 inhabitants in the world was urban. By the end of the 20th century, 3 out of every 6 was urban. And by 2050, 4 out of every 6 will be urban. And this means that the urban landscape is becoming the landscape of interest for economy, for mobility, for social interactions, and so on. The 1% of landmass that houses 55% of the world's population today accounts for 85% of global GDP, 78% of global energy use, and 60% of global carbon emissions. So clearly, there is a huge relevance to the urban context in which we have to rethink how mobility is being redefined. And it also relates to what kind of urban context are we talking about. And this is something very important for urban planners and city planners, particularly the developing world and certainly for India. Los Angeles is, in some ways, a motor capital of the United States. It has more per capita lane kilometers than any other US city. It has more surface area allocated to roads than any other US city. And yet it continues to have the country's worst traffic congestion and the worst air quality. Building more roads is not going to solve the problem. And there is an economic price to pay. It is estimated that 2.6% of US GDP is eroded as a consequence of urban sprawl. Now, it can be managed, as London has shown, by adopting policies that limit urban sprawl. The whole idea of London imposing limits on the sprawl of the city has had a major impact in the way the city has evolved and the way the economy of the UK has evolved. Now, here we face this in India. Our cities are expanding at unheard of rates. And if you look at this graphic, which compares 3 large global cities, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Los Angeles, it's very clear that we are actually moving far away from where Tokyo is, a country that has to support very high population density. While India has to deal with high population density, my fear is we're moving more towards the US model of cities with sprawl. And this is resulting in the fact that we're consuming huge amounts of, sustaining huge amounts of economic loss just to manage this amount of sprawl. So the first chapter is to saying, listen, if you don't get your urban planning right, no matter what you do with the mobility technologies, you're not going to solve your problem. The sustainability imperative is equally important. It's interesting that even in the United States, if you look at the carbon emission map, this is a CO2 map, what you see right in the center in green is actually New York City and Manhattan. On the east, you have Long Island, you have the Westchester County in the north, and New Jersey. The point is, dense communities have low carbon emissions mainly because of the transportation footprint. It's well known that people in New York, very few of them can afford to have a car or even bother to have a car and predominantly use public transit. So the component of CO2 emissions for a New York citizen is much lower, mainly because of the transportation element. And of course, in countries like India, we have to deal not only with the CO2 issue, but also the air quality issue. The fact is that most of our citizens today live in parts of the world where the quality of air is actually extremely unhealthy, and this is only getting worse as time goes along. As Rajan mentioned, 14 of the top 20 most polluted cities in the world as far as air quality is concerned, measured by particulate emissions, are in India. And while we may think that when we get to Euro 6, we might solve these problems, the reality is different. This is data taken last year from the city of Westminster in London. London, a city which has a fairly high fraction of cars that comply with Euro 6 emissions, they've noted that over 56% of their carbon emissions or particulate emissions and 57% of NOx emissions comes from road transport. So even moving to Euro 6 is going to be difficult. We've just seen recently in Germany that they're saying that you can't bring in a Euro 5 car into many parts of the city. It's hard to deal with a world where the only cars you can use were those made in the last 4 years. We have to find a different way to deal with this whole issue of air quality and emissions. And to sum up, we are paying a huge price today for the kind of mobility architecture we are sustaining. Between air quality, traffic accidents and fatalities, and congestion, global GDP is suffering a loss of anywhere between 6 and 10%, and increasingly this is becoming unsustainable. But this is also being, the change that we're seeing is also being promoted by changing consumer habits. I belong to a generation that had a love affair with cars. For us, cars were that social object, it was an object of desire, it was a mobility tool, it was a personal private space. But today, the younger generation find other tools that serve those functions. And as a result, in a recent survey that was done in the United States in college campuses, when students were given a choice of what they would have, a car with a lease plan or a smartphone with a data plan, 2/3 of the students preferred the utility of a smartphone with a data plan. So habits are changing, and these habits are changing in a world where with a smartphone, you have a whole lot of access to entertainment, recreation, and fun stuff that previously was not possible without a car. And then, of course, there is the emergence of the sharing economy. I love this cover story by Joel Stein from the Time magazine that highlighted how profoundly the sharing economy can change personal habits. And when you consider the fact that the personal car around the world is used for less than 4% of its time, of its life cycle, you realize that this is a huge waste of an expensive and a very sophisticated asset. And very often it's parked in very expensive real estate that is also not affordable. Now, as I said, the response from the auto industry of connected, shared, autonomous, and electrified is still not going to be adequate. And you may ask why. Well, let's take electrification as an example. Yes, it is going to contribute to making progress, but contrary to what many lay people believe, an electric vehicle is not a zero-emission vehicle. It is a zero tailpipe emission vehicle, but there is carbon emissions as a result of that mobility. And no matter what you do, depending on the quality of the electrical grid that you have, you're going to have not insignificant carbon emissions. And the core reason for this is rather simple. You know, to me, it is an absurd concept to say that my best mobility solution for you is a way where I can put a 65-kilogram occupant, wrap him or her in a 1,300-kilogram vehicle, and say, I've got an ideal mobility solution for you. And this is patently, absurd. And this is what we do today. Furthermore, there is a use of space that is required. As I talked about dense cities, an average car takes about 10 square meters of space. In Mumbai, that's valued at $200,000. In Tokyo, a parking spot is valued at $500,000. So we're having to allocate expensive urban land to the car. And you can see in this graphic, as cities are more car dependent, the amount of land you have to allocate to roads is very large. Tokyo allocates 15% of urban land to roads. Dallas allocates 40% of urban land to roads. And as urban land prices grow and urban land becomes more valuable, it's another reason why it's going to be unsustainable. So what will a transformed mobility architecture look like? We have come up with a framework, an architecture that we call CHIP mobility. And CHIP stands for Connected, heterogeneous, intelligent, and personalized mobility. What is this? Heterogeneity. Let's start with heterogeneity. Let us first start to fully imagine all of the possible mobility modes and truly make room for them in our cities. A lot of cities are starting to welcome pedestrians. They are taking old, disused railway lines or disused corridors and turning them into very attractive pedestrian zones. And a lot of people, particularly in downtown centers, actually would rather walk if they can have a nice walk to work or a walk to a restaurant in the evening. Scooters in my childhood were all meant for children below 5 years old. Today, scooters are becoming popular as urban last mile or first mile mobility devices. Companies as diverse as Porsche, Audi, BMW are trying to rush to make e-bikes. And you can imagine how one can transform cities, particularly cities in India, where a lot of commute distances are actually less than 3 kilometers or 4 kilometers. E-bikes can be a very popular solution as well. And if you think this is cute, this is Volkswagen showing at the Paris Auto Show the fact that they can have small trike pedal bicycles, electric augmented, of course. And if you were in Copenhagen, 45% of urban traffic is bicycles or pedal-powered. And if you wanted something more sophisticated, Toyota says, I've got a concept for you. And it's equally applicable to find this kind of innovations on the higher end. You know, 5 years ago, it didn't seem possible that you could have a pure electric bus that would provide adequate range in a city. And yet, by 2022, London will convert to electric fleet of double-deckers. So 200 kilowatt hours of storage is not a big issue anymore. And for all of us in cities that have worried about the fact that metro rail is very expensive on a per kilometer investment basis, lovely road trains are showing up that will take road space and provide a much higher density solution for high density corridors. So the message in all of this is there is a whole lot of variety that's possible. And just as nature solved this problem a long time ago for all of us, mobility, if you thought of transport of blood in a human body, we have different solutions for main arteries and different solutions for peripheral arteries. And we're going to have to deal with the same kinds of issues in urban traffic and urban transportation. And the solutions and the innovation don't only have to be with modal innovations. Uber came up with a lot of disruptive technologies of hailing, e-wallet, and summoning cars and managing a fleet with their technology. And then somebody said, if I could take the Uber concept and put 3 people in the car and I make it Uber Pool, I become even more attractive to a larger population. And somebody takes that concept further and says, by the way, if I could put a small van into use and move 10 people at a time, I provide even greater value. And by the way, is there disruption in this? You bet. If you were to hail this van, the Chariot van or the Via van in New York, for every rider that hails a van, the back-end server does what I understand is 10,000 scenario computations before it matches you to the right van for the right sequence of pickup, to the right sequence of drop-off, and to match you to the right one-way street and which van you're going to ride in. So this wasn't possible 5 years ago. It's possible today. And when you look at the whole excitement around autonomous vehicles, according to Ola Källenius, who's the new CEO of Mercedes, he says, very likely the first time we will see autonomous cars will be in so-called autonomous robo-taxis. And you can see everybody from Renault to Toyota to Volkswagen and Mercedes are out rushing to show robo-taxis. The message behind all of this is, when you look at all this heterogeneity, it's actually telling you one thing. It is converging towards solutions that will allow either better sharing of the asset or better sharing of space. And so this heterogeneity, in my view, is one of improving the way we will share mobility. And this means we have to share the space, we have to share the asset, and we have to share the energy. And that is, in my view, true shared mobility. And that is what this heterogeneity of mobility concept should allow. Once you have all of these concepts, you've got to connect them together. The old-fashioned way of connecting them was with physical infrastructure. At Frankfurt Airport Hub is a good example. You land in an airplane, and usually within 10 minutes of my landing in Frankfurt, I could be on a train going to Düsseldorf. Multiple options of connectivity right from a single hub. We find bicycle stations and sharing stations popping up around metro stations. That is a connectivity solution. London has the Oyster card that allows you multimodal connectivity with no hassle or no fuss. And increasingly, the smartphone is a tool for connectivity. So once you have all of this multiple modes and you can connect them together, you get to the next stage of saying, how do I intelligently synthesize a journey? Today, we have opportunities like never before. I have intelligence in my pocket, on my desk, in my home. I have intelligence in the car that has vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure capability, as well as intelligence in smart cities spewing data about city, traffic, parking, and all of this. And I'm therefore able to synthesize all of this information and therefore intelligently make a choice of how I want to configure my mobility. And finally, we live in a world where everything is personalized. I want a solution for me. I don't want a solution for the average 58-year-old male. So today's solutions allow you, therefore, to work through this set of options and configure for your priorities a customized journey, each journey at a time. Now, does this all seem vaguely familiar? The fact is, this is how our telecommunication landscape is. We have heterogeneity in the hardware that we use for communication and heterogeneity in the tools that we use to communicate. And as a result, and connectivity. The whole internet is possible because of packet switching and the network opportunities that we have, where each node is optimized for very rapid receipt of information and transmission of information. And so today, communication works where I use FaceTime to talk to my nephew, I use Skype to talk to my friends, I use WebEx for conferences and telepresence to give lectures. And I mix and match the modes depending on what I want to do. Why would mobility be any different? Now, how is this landscape of disruption moving? I think we're seeing phenomenal activity in all of the domains: mobility apps, mapping, self-driving cars, mobile tracking capability, traffic flow. There is new innovations happening every day and every week. And we see automakers already starting to synthesize a portfolio. So this is Daimler's portfolio. They have access to buses, trains, long-distance travel, city cars, bikes, parking, all of this within a Daimler environment. Now, all of this is still not enough unless we get to having the right policies and regulations. I'm very pleased to note that this session will be followed by a session about policy. I love the theory of the nudge by Professor Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017 for economics. And basically, his point is, policies and regulations coupled with investments will nudge behavior towards preferred modes. And what do we mean by this? If we go back over the last 4 decades, and most people in FISITA know this very well, the auto industry was nudged predominantly, if you were in the US, by regulations from the Department of Transportation, from NHTSA, and from EPA. From my understanding, 80% of R&D in the last 4 decades in the auto industry has been nudged by these organizations. In future, we're going to see cities join federal agencies and central agencies in nudging how we're going to use. And as a result, whether it's Carlos Ghosn or Jim Hackett, we're hearing CEOs of automakers saying, in future, we're going to partner with cities, we're going to work with cities to transform mobility. And it's not the automakers alone. You know, Uber, having been chastised for how they behaved in the past, have quickly transformed their own operating systems, and they're saying, we want to be a part of the city system solution, and that may include buses and mass transit. So I think if we're going to transform mobility, well, first of all, if we don't get your urban landscape right, nothing that you can do with technology is going to solve the problem. Beyond that, we can leverage the disruptions arising out of the heterogeneity of options, about the physical and digital connectivity opportunities that we have with technology, and how intelligent systems are proliferating, allowing us to synthesize journeys that are personalized for each journey and for each one of us. And importantly, regulators and policymakers have a very important role to play as they nudge this trajectory towards something that is good for all of society, towards a mobility architecture that we hope is faster, smarter, and greener. Thank you.
I would request Greg to enlighten us with his views on the disruption in this area that he sees.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's a real honor and privilege. So I will give a slightly different perspective, just coming more a little bit from the consumer angle to discuss. So I'll just be speaking freely here. Just to kind of unpack a couple of the terms. So I think the big sort of jargon, of course, of today is around shared mobility, smart mobility. So when you think about that, though, it's something we think about a lot internally at Zoomcar. And what does that really sort of fundamentally mean? Because I think too often people throw around words, but you don't really kind of unpack and take the time to reflect on what is really truly behind them. And so for us at Zoomcar, and then for me personally, when you think about shared mobility, it's really going to be more than anything. It's about access, and it's not about ownership. So I think that's a fundamental paradigm shift that you're seeing. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about cars, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about bicycles, electric scooters, buses, et cetera. But it's really, it's always about access. And I think you really touched on it well in the last discussion here, but around the notion of multimodal and shared mobility, the access of it, when you need it, where you need it. And I think that comes back, for me at least, to a really important quote. I think certainly one of the largest sort of scions of industry today, if you think about Jeff Bezos, one thing that he always says, which I think is so apt for what we're discussing right now today, is kind of look out. The future absolutely will change. 5 years, 10 years out, everything pretty much will change. There's a few fundamental truths that won't change. And that's really the key insight. And for shared mobility, when you think about mobility in general, and this is, I think, really important, what I want to touch on today, is the three fundamental truths that will never change. You always need to have convenience, you always need to have access, and you always need to have affordability. Now, if you think about mobility and you think about shared mobility, when you look out 10 years from now, are you ever going to ask yourself, I wish this were less convenient? I wish I had less access to it. I wish it was less affordable. No, of course not, right? I mean, that would be absolutely ridiculous. So the point is that everyone in the room here knows that in the future, 5 years, 10 years from now, that will be a truth, that you need mobility to be more accessible, more convenient, more affordable. And I think that's where shared mobility comes into play and really will disrupt. And I think I'm sure throughout the day today, a lot of folks are talking about the hardware side of it. I wanted to kind of shed more light around how software actually really plays the key role. Because it's really, I think especially a lot of the companies that were just mentioned and discussed, the true innovations that come around these 3 points around convenience, around access, around affordability, come really from software, more than anything. And it's about what you can actually build and continuously layer. Because I think what's really exciting and what's really dynamic about the mobility space and about software is that it really opens up so much potential. And the ability to keep layering in different use cases, layering in different functionalities, layering in customer experience, that's where it really becomes very, very powerful. Because going back to these sort of core prisms and these core points of mobility, what you're really kind of doing when you're talking about ensuring that you're going to have better access, better convenience, better affordability, is you're also kind of looking at it as a proxy and saying, well, you're eliminating friction. And I think with so many of the new businesses today, when you're thinking about mobility, you're thinking about how do you remove and eliminate friction from the user experience and journey. I think we're all consumers here, and I think I've been living in India for about 6 years, and I know when I first came to India in 2011, the sort of friction that was involved with even going 5-6 kilometers. And that was a process which was extremely painful, both from a time standpoint as well as from a money standpoint. But I think while leaving the traffic situation aside, because I mean that's of course somewhat out of the control of an operator or a player within the technology space. What you can control is really ensuring that when you think about mobility and you're thinking about a product and a service, you can reduce and eliminate friction. And I think a couple of examples of that, when you think about starting and ending a journey, whether it's taking an Uber and Ola, whether it's taking a Zoom car, whether it's going and using a shared bus in terms of that connectivity, if you can actually go and really get in and out in a way which is totally frictionless, I mean that fundamentally changes the paradigm and disrupts incredibly, because for so long that was not the case. That was really not the case. So I think when you really look out over the next few years and you think about the disruptions that will come within shared mobility, it's largely about eliminating the friction and being able to do something in a repeatable way. Because ultimately, this is going from point A to point B, or even the ability to go around to multiple points in a city or outside the city. It's really, you're looking at it more as sort of a human right. And that sort of flexibility, you want this to be a scenario where it is so easy to do that you get to the point where it's almost as easy as just like a reflex. And I think that's what the goal of so many of the companies today are really all about, and that's kind of the big focus area that will need to be addressed for the future. So to touch on some of the other themes that kind of unpack around this whole notion of access, convenience, and affordability, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about how the different sort of modes come together. When you think about the different opportunities, whether you're looking at something for a very short distance versus a medium or a longer distance. And I think that's where the whole notion of multimodal is so powerful, because in the future it's very unlikely that you'll find standalone companies that are just doing cars or just doing scooters or just doing bicycles. And you're seeing that happen already today, whether you look out in China, whether you look here even in India, you look to Europe or the US, et cetera. And I think what's powerful is that you see and you know that cycles, for instance, are the perfect solution for say 500 meters to 2 kilometers. You look out 2 kilometers to 10 kilometers, probably the scooter or the electric scooter would be very powerful. And then when you go beyond 10 kilometers is really when you start getting into the notion of a car. And that's something where if you ideally actually when you think about the power of a platform. And that's really what a lot of what we've been talking about now is platform companies, where you have the optionality to have these different levers there for you as a consumer. If you can go on a single app and you have the ability to book a car, book a bicycle, book a scooter, that can be incredibly powerful. Book a bus as well. And I think that's what you're seeing so many players start to move in that general direction. And that's really where you see so much potential getting unlocked. And I think what also, when you think about the powers of this mobility and this multimodal platform, I think what you're finding more often than not is that this opens up avenues of business which allow you as a business to monetize very, very differently. So if you look at just some examples, I think some of you guys who are familiar with, say, Southeast Asia or the China market, you find companies like Grab, companies like Gojek, companies like Didi, Meituan. So these are some of the largest mobility companies in the world in terms of market cap, right? So all of them are $10 billion plus market caps, and they're very, very successful. But if you look at them very closely, and what you're finding within mobility, as you're thinking about this multimodal stack, you're finding that companies are starting to grow and scale in a way where they actually don't even really start to look like mobility companies anymore. Mobility was maybe the start of what they did. They would move, maybe they started doing two-wheeler taxis, or they started doing ride sharing. But then soon enough, they started evolving into, because of their platform and because of the users and the high frequency, they started evolving into food delivery. They started evolving into O2O services, other avenues where they could monetize. And what's a really interesting trend which is happening, and we're seeing it happen at lightning speed, is that these large players, you're actually able to monetize in a very creative way, because you have such a sticky base and you can actually go into adjacent areas which give you much higher margin. So I think it's no secret, a lot of the names that were just shared here, very few of them are profitable. So very, very few of the players out there within ride sharing, within car sharing, within bike sharing are profitable. In fact, none of them are profitable at a scale. And I think the point, though, is not that these businesses are failures, obviously, but the point is that they're building industries, they're building markets, they're building platforms. And what you find is that as the platforms grow out, what I was just describing in terms of the potential to move into other adjacent industries, these adjacent industries give you much higher gross margin. And what oftentimes you're seeing is that the high gross margin over there can actually be used to subsidize both in terms of the actual ride, in terms of the rate, but also in terms of innovation. And I think what you're seeing is that the evolution of these sort of multi O2O service companies within mobility is actually probably the most important trend of the next 10 years that you'll be seeing. I think leaving aside electric, autonomous, and some of the other technical points, I think that'll of course come, but those are very much dependent on the government. I think we all realize that the private sector is always going to be moving at a faster pace than the public sector, and probably for good reason. But I think the point is that what's happening here in terms of these multimodal mobility platforms moving into a variety of different service areas, that is not something that is in any way constrained by the government. That's something that moves very quickly. And actually, just over a matter of 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, you see just transformational movements. And I think what that means is it allows you to think very differently about innovation within mobility, because you have that kind of leverage and that flexibility. And I think the final point to kind of call on, which ties all this together, is when you look at sort of these major concepts about sort of looking at access, looking at convenience, affordability, and you look at the multimodal stack, you look at the ability to do cross-monetization on the platform, what you're really getting to, and this is the core of the access era of economy as opposed to ownership, but you're getting to a place where efficiency is so much better. So when you look today, compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, by far the nugget that comes out the most is that the businesses are focused on maximizing efficiency. And so that's, when you think about shared mobility, that's really what it's all about. I mean, that ties together everything that I'm just speaking about here is the idea of being able to efficiently utilize an asset. Now, it doesn't matter if it's an owned asset. It doesn't matter if it's a marketplace. It could be with someone else. It could be with a driver. It could be with an operator. It could be your own. But the point is that the shared mobility platforms are very, very, very capable and competent about one important area, and that's how to best utilize an asset to take it. And this is actually not even just for shared mobility. This is for the shared economy in general. It applies to real estate. it applies to any other sort of form of an asset. But the ability to take something which ordinarily would run at 20, 30%, bring that to 50%, 60%, 80%. So at Zoom, we run at typically 70% utilization. And so that's, at an overall level, what you find with shared mobility platforms is since you have the ability to be multimodal, you have the ability to cross-monetize. So you could have one car, let's say, or one two-wheeler that's used for commuting. It could be used for logistics, delivery. You could have something for e-commerce, for food some of the time. Then you could have it being used to go out of station another part of the time. So you have multi-modes and mixed usage. So that's what's really, really powerful. So I think, just kind of wrapping it up, it's really about the possibilities of the efficiency that's brought in. It's about driving and leveraging software to actually ensure that the convenience, the access, the affordability is there. And I think that's really what's going to take us to that next level in terms of the access economy as opposed to the ownership economy. So thanks.
Thanks, Greg. I'm being told that we are short of time, so I think I probably have one question each for our panelists. Doctor, that is probably one of the finest, concise, and most comprehensive view of future of mobility that I have had the experience of seeing. My personal compliments to you, and that's indeed, nobody could have possibly put together a better picture of every comprehensive area of the likely disruptions that are going to happen. So, Doctor, my question to you is that, there is almost a mandate for new mobility that we are all seeing, which is coming from various things that we discussed: congestion, pollution, energy security, the new millennials, the cost of parking, etc., and the faster development of other technologies. There is a mandate. Now, this mandate needs policies, it needs incentives, right? And then there are regulatory bodies. What we are trying to see is what is happening is that for India, particularly since we are here and looking at the way our problems in India are different from the global problems. Problems of Europe, where congestion is less, pollution is far less. Therefore, what is your recommendation to the policy makers as to how we should not try to follow the route of technology that has got evolved elsewhere? So that we directly jump several steps of technology and come to the right technology for energy security, for pollution reduction, for congestion reduction, etc., etc. That means I personally see a lot of risk in that, because we typically tend to emulate the standards, the approach of the developed economies. I see a lot of risk in that. Therefore, my question to you is that if you were to frame the policy and incentives, what would your recommendation be?
Thank you, Rajan. It's a very large question, but let me take a very quick stab at it. First, I would say we must get our urban planners to first step up to the game. We can't solve this as a mobility technology or mobility solution problem alone. If our cities are going to sprawl uncontrolled with low density, I think we're going to become another Los Angeles. You look at Delhi, the way Delhi is spreading, it's already half the size of Los Angeles, and it's spreading at unprecedented rates. So first, we better get our urban planning right. But beyond this, to the theme of the chip architecture, we have to invest in infrastructure ahead of demand. In India, people go out and grab the first two-wheeler they can, not because of any other reason than they need basic mobility, and public transit is lagging the kind of mobility they can quickly go. So investment is a very important element. The second is cities around the world are finding very effective the use of a combination of incentives and levies. So it's called the so-called carrot and the stick. So if you, for instance, were to look at Tallinn, they've said public transit is free. They are, in a city like Copenhagen, every time a person uses a car, it costs the city 23 cents per kilometer. Whereas every time somebody uses a bicycle, it saves the city 16 cents per kilometer. So there is a reason they can cross-subsidize, and therefore they can incentivize public transit or bicycles and penalize use of private cars. We have failed to price city assets that we take for granted. Parking spots, for instance. Most Indian cities, parking spots are woefully underpriced, which means the city is subsidizing the cost of the parking to an affluent car user. So there has to be this combination of carrot and stick. And finally, I think we have to appreciate the power of dynamic policies that can steer the course of mobility. Singapore is probably the best example for this. So without taking more time, I think there is a combination of urban planning, investment, and the right combinations of levies and incentives.
Thank you. Thank you for that. If we have time, I will come back for one more question. Over to you, Greg. Greg, I was just noting down your thoughts, and I must say that I had a handicap. I had 3 handicaps. One is I was not able to listen to these speakers. They're sitting here. I think the echo is so much that I had a possible. Second handicap was that in his case, I had the presentation, so I could make out. But whatever, the third handicap was your accent was too high for me. And I must admit that publicly, these three handicaps that I've had. But nevertheless, the question to you is that what do you see as the challenges to various business models in terms of accelerating the growth of shared mobility? And if I was to qualify a little bit, do you see the challenge coming from the cost side, the cost of the assets that you are acquiring, or the challenges coming from the regulatory side, if any, moving forward? What do you see the challenges to the business models? Yeah, please.
Thanks. So yeah, I think when we look at this, it's important to take a step back and realize sort of where India is on the overall continuum of development relative to some other markets. And especially if you look out to China, even Southeast Asia, or of course Europe or the US, those ecosystems are much more developed. So I think it's important to get to the heart of your question. It's really about understanding how nurturing and how supportive those ecosystems are. And when we say ecosystems, very different types of stakeholders, whether it be financiers, whether it be different sort of vendors, whether it be other sort of partners that help with fulfillment and distribution. So the ecosystem in India is just much younger. And I think people just have to realize that we are young as an ecosystem and it's growing. And it will take longer to reach scale. It will be more complex. There'll be more bumps. It won't be as profitable in the near term. But I think more so aside from the cost angle, it's actually really the biggest challenge is really more fundamentally around how do you consistently deliver an outstanding user experience at scale. And I think what we've realized is in business, as you hit different inflection points, and I'm sure you guys have seen it in your businesses too, but as you hit different inflection points of scale, new customer experience problems come up. And I think for those who are very versed in the Indian market here, I think what we've realized is that, which is quite almost at times comical, is that you have people who have customers who have some of the highest expectations, but they have some of the lowest willingness to pay possible. And absolutely low willingness to pay, but super sky-high expectations. And then you also have customer behavior that oftentimes is quite poor. So you have this really interesting nexus. So how do you actually go as a business, and as you're thinking about shared mobility, which inherently is an offline service? We talk about software, we talk about all these nice elements of digital and the ability to deliver digitally, but it ends up being an offline business at the end of the day. So that offline last mile delivery and fulfillment as you scale is by far the most challenging aspect.
So, friends, in the interest of time, I will ask audience for 2 questions at best, because we don't have time for more than that. There's one gentleman who's raised his hand there, and one at the back. So these 2 people will take their question. Please tell us for whom is the question. Yeah, just keep it closer to your mouth.
Sure. My name is Satish Timalapura. My question is for Dr. Sumantran. You mentioned about the urban sprawl which has happened in India, unchecked and unplanned. You also mentioned about a nudges what is happening. In your estimation, what could be the nudges which could help us rein in the urban planning and which could help us, the urban infrastructure, be prepared for a shared mobility and a connected mobility?
It's a big topic, but the whole thesis around densification of urban spaces is a well-known topic in urban planning. As you start to look at densification, you have to reassess what you would call in India FSI. So you have to allow higher FSI because that is essentially a more efficient way of using space. The moment you increase FSI, corridors that go through those regions with metro rails and so on become more viable, because metro rails and high density transit modes need a high density of people along those corridors. So it's a large, complex issue of trying to say densification of a city with the right kind of planning, and ultimately the objective is economic benefits, social benefits. In fact, many cities are seeing urban rejuvenation. Cities like Detroit that saw a desertion of the city center 3-4 decades ago, are beginning to see young people come back because they like city life, they like eating places, entertainment spaces. So there is a social dimension, there is an economic dimension, there is an environmental dimension, as I explained, and we have to work towards that. And when you do that, the delivery of infrastructure becomes a lot more efficient. I can't put in more fiber optic cables, I can't put in more metro lines, I can't put in more public transit. If a city was sprawled out like Los Angeles, this becomes a problem, and Los Angeles has never been able to implement a mass transit system.
Thank you. Sorry, we don't have time for another question. Just to sum up, friends, we have the automotive fraternity sitting here, and I think the summary is very clearly for us automotive engineers is that we've been designing objects of desire, and these objects of desire have been finding way into objects of mobility. People have been monetizing them. But from now onwards, it's very clear, a large amount of our designs will be focused on objects of mobility. So the automotive fraternity will have to unlearn and relearn the requirements of mobility vehicles and start planning, gearing up the organization and building capabilities around that, along with the software that he mentioned, software platforms. So I see this disruptive technology opening up an entire new era for the automotive world. With those words and thanking the panelists, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rajan, for the wonderful conduct. I request Mr. Rajan Wadhera to present the memento to our speakers, Dr. Sumantran. I also request Mr. Rajan to present memento to Greg Moran.